I'm delighted to say Kumi Naidoo joins us in the studio, and we still have the writer and economist Dambisa Moyo here with us too. First of all, we'll get on to the wider issue of whether aid works or doesn't work in a moment, because I've got a feeling you have very different ideas about that. But on a personal level, somebody watching this, worried about their job, worried about their house, is going to say, you know what, charity begins at home, forget it.
Well, the issue of how the world is connected today means that people need to recognize that growing the world economy is critically important. Let's understand that what we are asking for is nothing new. This commitment of 0.7% was made more than 35 years ago. Unlike with the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, where 1% was offered with no restrictions and so on, but that actually helped ultimately the United States because it grew the world economy. So people need to understand that actually investing in Africa and the rest of the developing world also deals with some issues that people are concerned about, such as immigration and so on. Because if people have livelihoods back home, they don't need to be desperately trying to get onto European countries, for example. So there's an element of self-interest.
Well, Dambisa, it's self-interest. That's what drives those cogs of capitalism, then it just makes sense to do it.
Well, I think, first of all, it's a great shame that African governments were not, and actually not just African governments, global policymakers were not operating with the anticipation that one day Africa would be required to stand on its own 2 feet, which is why we're in this situation where African governments in many cases are 70% or even higher dependent on aid. The fact of the matter is aid has not worked. The original architects of aid had two goals in mind. One was to deliver growth, and number 2 was to alleviate poverty. And on those 2 metrics, it's absolutely failed. The expectation that Africa and Africans should sit back and expect the world to step in and help them is completely absurd. And as far as I'm concerned, it's really the root of the problem that we're seeing right now.
Kumi.
But that presumes that what we are asking for is charity. What we're asking for is justice. Let's be very clear that Africa and the rest of the developing world have not been compensated properly for the injustices of colonialism. Africa is one of the richest continents underneath the ground, and precisely for that reason, we are one of the poorest continents above the ground. And right now, we are saying that not that aid is perfect, far from it. We are critics of the aid system. But what we are saying is that we need the aid modalities to be reformed, conditionalities that rich countries put as burdens on developing countries to be addressed and so on. And so while I could agree with you on some of the weaknesses in the aid system, my conclusion, especially at this time of world history, when there is such a global financial calamity, we will be punitively punishing yet again.
Well, let me ask you, Dambisa, without aid, what will happen?
Well, I think what will happen is what we've seen in other places in the world, where emerging countries have actually been able to achieve double-digit economic growth when they actually take another approach. They focus on building the economies through jobs and entrepreneurship, and they encourage the economies, the private sector of the economies to grow. This whole notion of focusing on colonialism in Africa's past, it will always be part of Africa's past. India was also colonized, and yet we don't sit around feeling sorry for India, and neither do we hear Indians on the global stage saying we want to be compensated. You get on with it. It's been 50 years since many African countries were given independence. Personally, I don't want to sit around for another 10, 20, 30 years hearing Africa whinge about the fact that they were colonized.
Right.
It's time to move on.
Well, okay, so when do Africans move on then? I mean, those are some very strong words.
Well, Africans are moving on. We are moving in a positive direction in many countries on the continent in terms of strengthening democracy. We've got huge deficits on the other end, where we are failing. And this argument that Dambisa makes in a book that just because you borrow on commercial markets, therefore you are going to be less corrupt. For example, right now, if we look at which is the most corrupt country on the continent, it's probably Zimbabwe, and they have been starved of aid over the last couple of years, and we still see whether you borrow on commercial markets or whether you borrow where you get grants, concessional grants, at the end of the day, the governance question in Africa is a different one. And so to conflate those 2 issues is a mistake.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. A fascinating debate.